we go. We're good.
All right, here we go. So welcome to Illinois SciComm. As you can see on the screen, a couple of things before we get started. It's helpful for you to turn on your camera. It's nice to see who we are talking to. Please let Twitter know that you're here using the hashtag ILSciComm. It's good to kind of connect us all and see what's going on. Take a second, if you can, to share your Twitter handle in the chat window so that we can all continue to connect through Twitter. And please, for our sake, take the pre and post data, the pre and post survey, which Janine will link to in the chat window. You can't actually click on. Thank you for pointing that out. You can't click on through here. Our contact information, Janine and I's contact information is down at the bottom. You can find more of our work at ilclassroomsinaction.org, Science Teachers in Action.org, and on Facebook under IL Classrooms in Action. So we have two goals for holding these events. The first one is to foster a supportive statewide virtual professional learning network of science educators, and the second is to find new ideas, share the wonderful things happening in science education in the state of Illinois, and to spread the joy and wonder of science. So I am Jesse Samine, and I'm joined by Janine Shepard. We are both science content specialists, and we are the hosts for IL SciComm each month. Our team of content specialists is employed by the Center for Educational Initiatives at Illinois State University, which partners with ISB to support teachers in Illinois with the implementation of the NGSS learning standards. So like we mentioned before, a little housekeeping. If you've missed this, if you've not already turned on your camera, please do so now so we're able to have a fully authentic conversation. And while we'll be encouraging you to talk during our discussions, while our invited guests are talking, please put yourself on mute to eliminate some of that background noise. When you have questions or an idea to share, just click on the microphone to unmute yourself if you don't have access to that chat feature. If there's a lot of background noise or feedback, we may mute you, so don't be offended if that happens. Take a second to rename yourself to reflect who you are. So to do that, you just hover over your video window. The three dots will appear, and you can rename yourself that way. A quick disclaimer before we start, any discussions here are not an endorsement by ISB or ISU. We are merely providing a platform to share ideas and resources. So this month we decided to combine our IL SciComm with our first meeting of our Illinois Science Educators Book Club. For the book club, science teachers, administrators, and other educators will be reading and discussing the book Ready, Set, Science, Putting Research to Work. Oh, there it is, I see it. Putting Research to Work in K-8 classrooms. The book is available as a PDF download for free at the link in the chat window. And you could also purchase a paperback copy from that same site. The book club will use Zoom like we are today to meet every other Wednesday. Our next meeting will be on Wednesday, November 9th from 3:30 to 4:30. And you are still able to register to join us. So Janine's going to add that link to the chat to register for the book club. We will also be posting using the hashtag ILSciEdBookClub on Twitter if you'd like to follow along with us on social media. For today, for the IL SciComm and the first meeting of the Illinois Science Educators Book Club, we are excited to hear from Dr. Heidi Schweingruber. In addition to being one of the co-authors of our book club, Dr. Schweingruber is the director of the Board of Science Education at the National Research Council and is an Illinois native. She co-directed the study that resulted in the report, A Framework for K-12 Science Education, which is the foundational work that our NGSS standards were built upon. So after that short introduction, short because of all the, there's a lot more great work that she has done, we're going to turn it over to Dr. Schweingruber.
Great.
I'm kind of excited to have this conversation with you guys, and I hope we can do a back and forth in questions. I definitely can't just talk to myself for 45 minutes, so hopefully you guys will ask questions. I wanted to do a few things. Jesse had asked me to kind of set the context for the book that you're reading and illustrate some of the connections to the framework and the NGSS, and I'll try to do that some. And then hopefully we can have some discussion around that. So first of all, I find it's always helpful to explain what the National Research Council and the National Academies even is. Even though folks have been engaging with the framework and NGSS, I don't think it's obvious who we are and how we're positioned nationally. So we are not a government agency, even though it says national. We are an independent nonprofit. Some folks on here may have heard the kind of story of the origin, which is we were founded by Abraham Lincoln. And the whole idea was to tap the scientific expertise in the country. And the very first question that was posed was how to use a compass on an ironclad ship. And that was in the Civil War. And since then, we have grown in size to offer, basically our fundamental role is to offer advice to the nation in science, engineering, and medicine. So it started in science, then became medicine and engineering. So we do that in a whole variety of ways, but one of the sort of flagship projects that we do are what we call consensus committees. So typically someone comes to us with a question, or sometimes I have a standing board and they scan the landscape of science education for kind of what are the important issues, and they may say we need to do a study here, and then I find money to support it. But we pull together a group of national experts to study a problem, look at the evidence, and then provide some guidance. So the board's been around since 2004, and actually Taking Science to School, which is the report that Ready, Set, Science is based on, was only the second project that the board did. And the whole idea was someone came to us and said, look, we have standards in science education, the National Science Education Standards and the benchmarks. We are trying to do things in classrooms that are following through on the inquiry idea. But we know there's a whole body of work out there that's research on learning and a growing set of people who are doing research actually in classrooms instead of stuff that just happens in laboratories. Can you tell us what that research says about how kids learn science, and then what that means for teaching and for classrooms and for what curricula should look like? And so that was the basic question. We put together a group of people to study that question. It had to include educators, so we had educators in the committee, as well as people who do research on teaching and learning. They studied the problem and came up with Taking Science to School. From the beginning, we knew that it would end up being, the initial report would be super research heavy. Lots of citations, you had to make the case really well, and sometimes really technical kind of academic writing. So all along, the people on our board said, you're going to need to find ways to make it more obvious what are the implications for teachers and for educators, because a lot of times you can read original research and it can feel very academic and disconnected from the day-to-day of what you do in a classroom. And it's also a pretty heavy lift to ask a teacher to read a big academic book and then figure out what that means for how you teach or the vision of instruction. And so Ready, Set, Science was the effort to say, there's all this research that we've pulled together with some implications for what should happen in K-8 classrooms. How do we make that more connected to practice? When someone's saying, so what does that mean about what I do in my classroom next year? Or even what does that mean about what I should be doing in my classroom next week? Can we provide something that gives a little bit more of an answer to that question? And so that's what Ready, Set, Science was sort of trying to do, was open it up and say, here's what a classroom would look like if you were trying to do it in a way that's faithful to the research. So that was the premise. It was actually one of the first times that a whole bunch of different lines of research were pulled together to answer that question. It then became one of the foundational pieces for the framework for K-12 science education, which then informed the next generation science standards. So the fundamental principles about learning and teaching were sort of brought out in Taking Science to School and Ready, Set, Science. And then there's a direct line that you can trace to the framework and how it's put together and the NGSS. And so even though now Ready, Set, Science might be considered dated, that research base and the insights on how children learn are really not dramatically different. And so the book can still be incredibly useful for understanding those foundational ideas and why the framework and NGSS are put together the way they are, and kind of what they're aiming for as the learner's experience, and how you as a teacher can shape that experience. Let's see. So any questions just on that kind of overview and the connection to the framework and NGSS? And I'm really of the mind that all questions are totally fine. So I don't see any in the chat box, and I don't hear anybody asking them.
Myself.
Portion of what you were saying.
Okay. I don't know.
Jesse, you?
Yeah, so you talked a little bit about taking science to school. Can you talk a little bit about the goals of that book as a precursor to Ready, Set, Science?
Yep. So one of the, what we're doing when we put together these committees is pulling in a bunch of people. So the basic premises of taking science to school, the question to the group was, we have a bunch of new research on learning and teaching. We've been doing stuff in schools based on these old standards. If we put that all together, what should we be doing? What are the new insights? And so the notion is, look at all the different lines of research. So there's a bunch of work that's sort of basic cognitive science that might be done in what we would call a lab, where somebody comes in and does a pretty artificial, isolated task. But then there's a whole continuum of research to people who are working in partnership with teachers doing stuff in classrooms. It's pull all of that together and tell us, expert group, what you think that means for what should be happening. Like, what can you say with certainty from all that evidence about how kids learn, and then what that means about and curriculum in classrooms? And then what recommendations would you have for how things move forward? So the Taking Science to School was pulling all that research together. It was laying out the conclusions and recommendations, but also providing all the discussion of the evidence that supports it. So it's a deeper dive into the evidence. But I don't know if anybody here has looked at that book. I think it's very good, but it doesn't go all the way. Ready, Set, Science then has these vignettes and much closer to instruction discussion about, okay, how do you do this with kindergartners? What would it look like if you took all those principles and put them together and had a discussion about trying to get kids to understand atomic molecular theory? Like, it's unpacking more, what does that actually mean? And so Taking Science to School gives you a really deep dive into the evidence that supports doing things that way. And that was the notion, was to pull all that evidence that lived in really different places. It was in journal articles, a lot of it, or it might be people who have 30 years in the classroom and what they've sort of come to understand. It was what was learned from people trying to implement the benchmarks and the NSES. And it was like, that's not all in one place. Let's put it all in one place. But then, as you might imagine, when you get a group that includes a lot of academics on it, the resulting book is a little heavy and a little academic, and a little can be distant from the realities of the classroom. And so that's what Ready, Set, Science was trying to do. Any other questions about connections to NGSS or framework or any of the history stuff? So what I wanted to do next was highlight some of the ideas that I thought in Taking Science to School and then are highlighted in Ready, Set, Science were some of the new insights. I think what's going to be interesting is whether, given how much you guys have dug into the framework and NGSS, these may not seem like new insights to you, right? But they were some of the new insights from Taking Science to School and Ready, Set, Science. So I want to lay some of them out, and again, you can interrupt me or stick some questions in the chat window. So there were sort of two lines that I found really interesting. One was new insights on what it even means to do science, right? And we knew we were going to look at how kids learn and all that literature, but one of the things that the group really looked at was, wait, what's happening when you do science anyway? Do we really understand that? And it turned out that a lot of scientists are really bad at knowing what they're really doing. And that the concept that you had sort of a lone scientist making these discoveries out of the blue is really outdated. And science is very social in nature. There's a lot of stops and starts. This notion of argumentation and arguing about evidence is really fundamental to science, but often scientists themselves don't see how much they're doing that and how much it's a social process, that you're going back and forth with each other and trying to figure out what's right. And so that sort of notion that it's not just a lone wolf, a brilliant lone wolf, was kind of a new insight that some scientists didn't have. Another line of work, of course, was the notions about how people learn. And there were sort of two big themes. One was just the implicit models of what it means to learn science, and those were really changed by the research. And another was how you get there. So some of the implicit models about learning are things like you just pour the knowledge into the kid's head, right? That it's just about knowledge, and sort of the lecture model is set up as you just open up someone's brain and you pour in the knowledge and then it's in there. So that's sort of, it's implicit. We often don't talk about it, but that's kind of implicit in the approach. There was a woman on the committee, Leona Schabel, who used to say there seemed to be like another model that she called the snowball model of science learning, which was the notion that you just gradually accumulate little bits of knowledge like a snowball rolling down the hill, and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and suddenly you'll get enough knowledge and you'll have insight. Like you'll totally understand scientific explanations because you've just accumulated all this knowledge, all these facts. And not surprisingly, it turns out that both those kind of implicit models about learning, the research on learning say, are just not accurate. Instead, and this may now seem obvious, but at the time, these were insights that we were pulling together. Kids are really actively trying to make sense of the world. So they're actively constructing their knowledge. They're pulling things together. They're making their own inferences from what they observe. And so even if you're trying to just pour knowledge into their heads, you have to realize they're trying to make sense of it. And what you think you're telling them may not be what they're actually getting because they're actively working on it. And so that led to this notion of creating situations where kids are able to work with the knowledge more. In parallel with that then was a critique of how science had been framed in school was often what people would call final form science, which means you just had kids memorize all the facts, right? Science was seen as just this body of knowledge that these amazing, super smart people figured out, and your job as a science learner is just to memorize it all, just to take what they did and as received knowledge and memorize all of it. But when you put together all those elements of how science really happens and then how kids actually learn, that model is not going to work. So that's what moved us away from thinking textbooks and lecture and things like that, because it's a much more dynamic, how you build science knowledge is much more dynamic, and how people put together an understanding and skill is much more dynamic. So those kinds of insights are part of what have led then to the framework and the NGSS. Another insight was that kids' capacity is much bigger than we thought. There were old models of kids learning that assumed they were sort of slightly incorrect interpretations of Piaget and his notions of development, and that, you know, you're pre-operational and you're concrete, and so you can't think in sophisticated ways. There's a ton of research that was refuting that, but it hadn't been pulled together. So for the K-5 especially, that was really important to say, look, no, kids can discuss really complicated ideas and do things in really sophisticated ways. And in addition, this complicated starting early building of knowledge across time is part of what led to the notion of learning progression. So the idea of learning progressions is something that emerged from the work in taking science to school. They were picking up some ideas that were coming up in the research literature and then saying, what does this mean for curriculum? And the notion that you can't do little bits of ideas in disconnected ways, which elementary science was a little bit guilty of, you know, rainforests, whales, let's do something on let's hatch our butterflies, in a really not necessarily thinking about, as kids construct their knowledge, how are they building understanding? And that's where the idea of learning progressions sort of started to originate, was let's be much more intentional about how we're helping kids put this knowledge together. There is a question in the chat. I've thought a lot about text and how to best utilize text. My school has a contract with a particular textbook company. I'm required to use it. In your opinion, what is the best way to incorporate text? So what we're finding, and I think that when you are able to dig into Ready, Set, Science, that may be a question you want to hold in mind as you dig into it too, but I'll put on the table that many would say it's not the case that what you want to do is pre-read. That having kids somehow read it and think that you've got to cram that knowledge and vocabulary up front is not necessarily the best way for the kids to take meaning from what they're reading. And that's part of what's informing the switch to the phenomena-based and start with a phenomena kind of in a driving question kind of approach, is to have kids have an experience really digging in and starting to try to understand, put up front what they do know and understand and the questions they have about it. Then when you move them to be reading the text, they're going to be able to connect with it more. They're going to have a more critical lens for reading it, and it's going to be more meaningful to them. And that's typically what the recommendations would be, is find other places to use the text and to have them be pulling in the text as another source of information. I would also argue that where possible, find other modes than the textbook. So if you can find, there's lots of places now that have science news for kids and journals that might have a similar topic, so that you could have them be looking at the textbook and looking at other kinds of writing. And incidentally, that's gonna work toward many of the literacy goals for elementary anyway, where they're being asked to engage more with nonfiction. And so it's going to give them you can give them multiple kind of modalities of reading about the same stuff, but not front loading, like get the knowledge in their head and then they're somehow going to use it. They're going to build their knowledge as they come to understand and ask questions about a phenomena. Other questions, comments? Let's see, I had notes about things that I wanted to highlight. So one of the things, and this is something that's gotten a lot of uptake from what we did in Ready, Set, Science. One of the big ones was the making thinking visible idea. And this really goes to a lot of the discussions about how are we doing assessment in these sort of new modes of classrooms, which is, if we know that kids, all this stuff is going on in a kid's head and they're constructing knowledge, and you can't just assume that what you handed off is what they're getting, and they're actively putting together understanding, you have to have a lot of strategies for getting it out of their heads so that you as a teacher can see it. And so that, since we're now looking at science as a social process, other kids can see it, so that you're helping push on each other's understanding. And so that's where this turn to different ways of making thinking visible was really coming from, was understanding that there's so much more going on in someone's head, and how do we get a window on it? And also that pushing on each other's thinking is part of what you do when you're doing science. Like, you realize, hey, I have an idea about that data that's super different from your idea, and that's actually generative, like it helps us get to a better understanding. Well, you have to have a way to get the ideas out there so that they can be compared. And so you'll see a lot of what we talk about in Ready, Set, Science on the instructional end is, how do you get those artifacts out there? How do you get something that captures what kids are thinking about? So what else might we highlight? Questions, comments? I'm giving a little wait time here, but I also can dive right back in. So two things that I wanted to mention. one thing that you'll see in Ready, Set, Science, that sometimes people say, I don't understand what happened to this. It doesn't show up in NGSS and framework, are the strands. So you'll see, I know you probably haven't dived into it yet, but there are 4 strands of knowledge that the book talks about. And it can be confusing because that doesn't map to like the disciplinary core ideas or their cross-cutting concepts or their practices. So it's like, what's up with these 4 strands? And the way we've sort of thought about it is the 4 strands together are kind of what's happening with kids when they're actually engaging in doing science. The dimensions in the framework are more like end goals, the things that you want them to be able to show proficiency in. So the 4 strands are in some ways the process of learning, and the dimensions kind of are the outcomes that you're going for. It says my internet connection is unstable, so I hope I don't break up. If I do, I'll just shut off the video. So the one thing, doing and knowing are totally intertwined, right? So that you're not just learning content separately, but that you're doing things, that when you're doing science, it's always knowledge and use. And that's where the practices come from. The notion that you're always doing some kind of science or engineering practice using knowledge, and they're totally intertwined. And that means you don't do a chapter on inquiry or a chapter on the practices or a chapter on the scientific method. We don't talk about the scientific method anymore, please. So you don't do that first chapter and then think you're just going to treat content. That it's all the way along, you're doing the practice, you're doing the inquiry, totally intertwined with content. And that's because if you're collecting data, you're collecting it about something. If you're making an argument, you're arguing about some kind of evidence that was about some kind of phenomena or question. If you're developing a solution, it was a solution to a particular problem. So you can never tease them apart separately. It doesn't make sense to abstract them. So that's definitely raised in Ready, Set, Science, and it's a fundamental part of the framework in the NGSS. That's the whole point, is you're totally putting them together all the time. It's one of the hardest things that it's asking us to do, because that's not how we've thought about science before. Our assessments don't do it that way. We haven't been asked, like textbooks haven't been organized that way. So to me, that's one of the hardest switches, is to kind of change our practice to look that way. And Ready, Set, Science was one of the first attempts to show what that would look like. So there's a couple other questions. Let's see. One is incorporating modeling with students. That's a tricky one. I would say, I've been told that the chapter on modeling in Ready, Set, Science is not as robust as it could be. So you may want to be thinking about that when you look at the chapter. I would say it's hard for me to do a ton of examples right off the top of my head, but maybe I can think about that and send some suggestions to Jesse for when you guys are reading that chapter, because that might be a time to really dig in on it. Your principal's always talking about making learning visible. Can I continue to elaborate a little bit about how to do that? So actually, there are some specific suggestions in the book. There's some chapters that are on it that are about that. One of them is talk and argument. So just verbalizing what you're doing. You can do it in writing too. It's sort of getting people to put it out there. That has the dual purpose of letting other people hear and think about your ideas. It also is the case, I think, as educators, we know this, when you're trying to explain it to someone else is when you realize how little or much you understand or don't, right? So you know you really don't understand it if you start to try to tell someone and you can't even put a sentence together. And so it's very helpful for the kids in that way, but also lets things get out on the table. Modeling and representation is another one, which is why the modeling is such a good question. It's the idea of let's draw a picture, for example, of what we think is happening, or what are your ideas, you know, in a written form about how this might look. So those kinds of development of artifacts. you can develop artifacts of talk and argument. There's lots of examples. You can see them all over Facebook and Twitter and whatever, of driving questions boards and having, making public documents that capture all of that talk that's going on. Let's see. Do I suggest teaching the cross-cutting concepts explicitly in the curriculum so students are aware when they are looking at structure and function, etc.? I do. I actually think that's a really hard, the cross-cutting concepts turn out to be one of the harder things for people to know how to work with. The DCIs are pretty typical. Sure, there's some new ideas like waves and whatever that weren't there in a deep way before, but the cross-cutting concepts are some of the hardest things that people are trying to figure out how to weave in. You could look for more ideas. You could look at, for example, there's Open SciEd, which just released some middle school units. It might be interesting to look at those and see how they do the cross-cutting. A lot of what I've seen is make sure you're using the wording, the terms that would be related to it, highlight where you see the cross-cutting concept. When you move on to some other DCIs, you can raise, point out how the cross-cutting concept might apply. I personally think we need to be judicious about how many cross-cutting concepts we're asking kids to try to play around with at the same time, in the same unit. So you can be judicious across a year, across a couple years, about how you're asking kids to engage with them. That's a question for your school or your district with respect to curriculum. That's my personal opinion. I think expecting that every time you have a new phenomena or a new problem, you're going to then hammer every single cross-cutting concept doesn't make sense. You're not hammering every DCI. Why would you do that with cross-cutting concepts? So that's my personal opinion. There may be people actually on this chat that would have a different opinion about that one. Let's see. Other questions? So I was talking about the connection between the strands and the dimensions. I also wanted to raise the issue of inquiry. So we've had a lot of kind of critique about where did inquiry go, or what's the connection to inquiry. And what we typically say is that the practices are the evolution of inquiry. And so that inquiry often was a blob. I would say it was a Rorschach after a while. It was whatever anybody saw in it. And the practices are much more fine-grained about, okay, what are you really doing? And I will say, if I go into a classroom, I should see practices in a science classroom. There shouldn't be anything the kids are doing that I can't name as a practice, right? If they are, they're not doing science. So it's a much more explicit way of thinking about what it means to be doing inquiry. And part of why I say we don't want to be talking about the scientific method is that there's not one order to the practices. You jump all over and you're pulling them in as appropriate. Scientists do that too. And so to say there's only one way of doing this is just not authentic to how science happens. And there's actually really different ways of doing scientific research across different disciplines in science too. So that's one of the things that's really driven home. And I think you'll see that when you're reading Ready, Set, Science, sort of that idea of practice, the idea of science as practice. Ready, Set, Science is one of the first places that it started to come through, is that's what kids are doing when they're doing things in the classroom. Oh, so Jesse said, inquiry is part of your social science standards in Illinois. That's really fascinating. What insights can we share? Can you tell me a little more about what you think they mean by inquiry in the social science standards?
Yeah, right. That's a great question. So yeah, this is, and actually Janine and I were just part of a workshop recently that was for a lot of teachers who were there, introducing inquiry through the lens of social studies, because it is part of their standards now, is some of those inquiry practices. And I kind of had brought up a little bit that science education had been using that word to the point that it didn't mean anything anymore. And then was kind of thinking ahead, like, how long is it going to take for social studies to get there? and just trying to help them, maybe help them see that's where we were and where we
Yeah.
are now, to kind of help with that.
Right. I have a couple of different reactions. I'm other people should feel free to chime in too. I know there's folks on here who have deep experience with NGSS framework and know Ready Set Science. So please feel free to chime in. On this one, I think two things. One, if social studies is starting to open up the box and think about what they're doing as sort of a more open, exploratory, inquiry-oriented thing, that's a good thing. Because I think they were as much into the factoid, just memorize this kind of thing. So if they're opening it up, fabulous. That actually is gonna, I think, for an elementary teacher who has to possibly juggle both science and social studies, whatever, that might make things a lot easier. You're starting to understand, you have a similar approach. Maybe the science can help them say, okay, you can say inquiry, but even if it's not in the standards, when you're doing curriculum and when you're figuring out how to help folks design their instruction, you're going to have to help them be more explicit about what they mean. But that's really the lesson science learned, right? Was it's not enough to just say do inquiry, that you have to be more explicit about how kids are going to do that, what it means to do that, and therefore what it means as a teacher about how you're going to organize the learning experience. You can maybe help the social studies people realize you're going to have to do that. Even if your standards don't, you're going to have to do that if you want to have something meaningful happen in the classroom. So I think it's good, but you're right, they probably need a little nudge to do it in a more concrete way. Your school does a history fair where they have the theme. So I'll just tell you, I have a son who's an 8th grader, and he had to do this history thing last year, Triumph and Tragedy, and it was quite a tragedy in our house. He was very frustrated with how he had to engage in it. So I'm very sympathetic. Yeah, so that they could have, I think they could probably use a little guidance about what do you want, how do you want kids to inquire? What does it mean for them to inquire about this? And to be a little bit more explicit, and at least our experience, the interpretation could have been opened up a little bit more to allow kids to bring their own creativity and some of their own critique. I've talked a lot. I feel like there must be some things that I put on the table, or I'm also open to, if the things that you've been doing with the NGSS or with the Illinois standards, if you're like, this seems to run counter to what you've said, or we haven't been able to do this, I'm totally open for those kinds of questions too. Believe me, I get pushback on some things when we talk about this work. You can jump in.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So I'm the only teacher in my district that teaches what I teach, and I kind of don't even use a specific textbook, but I'm supposed to cover the curriculum that the person before me did, and I'm trying to use phenomena and things like that. It's just a lot to kind of try to write my own storyline and do all that. So what do you advise? Because I don't want to do traditional textbook stuff, but I can't entirely write my own curriculum.
Right. What level are you teaching?
I teach low-level freshmen.
High school. Yeah.
And life science.
Okay. High school, we don't have open SciEd materials. It's very tricky. There is a biology curriculum. Folks out of California did it, and I'm trying to remember. And there's also the storylines curriculum.
Right, I'm familiar with that.
Yeah. I mean, I guess one, get connected to other teachers. There's a ton of different groups out there. I'm sure since you're on this group, you probably already do try to do that. I mean, I also think, and I'll defer to Jesse and Janine on this too, because I know I don't want to subvert anything that's going on, but to also say, am I really ready to go full bore on this across the whole year on every topic right now? That maybe there's, and we say this actually in Ready Set Science at the end, And you know, this was before the NGSS and the framework, but I think it still applies. It's okay to say, I'm going to take smaller steps, baby steps, or I'm going to see, you know, I've got a really great idea and I love this particular storyline and it connects to stuff I have to do. So I'm going to do this. I'm not going to make myself do it for every piece of the curriculum over the whole year. And it over multiple years, then you could probably build up some things. But I feel like this is a big change. And it's not necessarily fair, given what we know about lack of curriculum materials, to ask every teacher to reinvent a curriculum, a full bore, year-long or multi-year long curriculum on their own. And so to give yourself permission to do it in places, kids will love those experiences when they get them. My expectation would be that their discussions will be richer, even when you can't do the full bore, when you maybe can just do some smaller kinds of investigations. But that would be my advice, is to figure out where you feel most comfortable doing it, or where you might already be able to find something, but don't feel like the transformation has to happen all at once, overnight, full bore. Now, I don't know what, like Jesse or Janine, what you think about that advice, whether that's going to get you guys to where you want to be with the implementation.
No, yeah, I think, I mean, and you're not the only one in that boat where there's not necessarily a network or a professional learning community to work with to get to that place. But that's part of what we're trying to create is kind of touchstones. I'm going to ask Nicole maybe to speak a little bit about, ISTA has some storylines written for life science, and then iHub as well. So Nicole, I don't know if you want to jump in here and just tell us what's available through those organizations.
Oh no.
Nicole, you must have a lot of background noise. We cannot hear your words.
Nicole wasn't
Bummer.
planning on speaking.
You put her on the spot.
Yeah. But through the ISTA website, you can access, they do have a full year biology storyline curriculum that was written by Illinois science teachers. And then through iHub as well, has some science units linked to it. And then I will also put in the chat from the NGSS site, the things that have been identified as quality examples, and there's some high school life science examples there. So we're finding a lot of people kind of patchworking some things together, and then being creative, like the ISTA people were being creative about getting groups of people together to help each other out on that journey.
Okay, is this better now?
Yeah.
Okay, I was like, I know my
You're like, I'm
was
just gonna
I'll
sit
try
back
this
and listen.
Yeah. So ISTA has a full year biology with 6 different storylines. I think they're working on some more. A couple of them have some really great tie-ins to Earth and space science. The Africa storyline and the sea otters and the penguins have some really great ties into Earth and space science as well. Inquiry Hub has a full, which is Next Gen Storylines, has a full biology curriculum for high school. They have 1 chemistry unit out. They're working on more for chemistry. And trying to think, if you go to the Achieve website, the Science PRP, you can just look up some exemplars, and there's some physical science ones out of Michigan up there at the high school level.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, earth science seems to be the hardest to find.
Right, and in fact, actually Achieve just sent out through some of the social networks a plea for people to submit earth science units to them because they're not getting them. And I actually shared it with folks I know in higher ed and earth science, some of whom do some of this work, to say, you may not be connected with the K-12, but come on, you need to generate this. So I'm hoping that might scare up some things.
So I just, last week, I asked my student, I just like for a phenomenon, I'm like, okay, find a partner and tell me what causes seasons. Because, the autumn equinox
Right.
just came up.
Right.
And 90% of them were convinced that it was because we were closer to the sun during that part of our Earth's orbit.
Right.
And so then I said, well, what about Australia? They're having the opposite season we are at this time. Are they? And then that really puzzled them. And so then they were ready to kind of dig in and do some stuff. And
Yeah,
so we'll see how they do on the test. I don't know. That's
I
going to
know.
be a tough question.
Right. But that's a great, I mean, that's a little bit, that's a phenomena way in. And great way to bring up issues that's going to make them question their model of what's going on. I think that
Because we all think, oh, they've had this in grade school, they've had it in junior high, and they, still come to us in high school and really don't get it.
right. I don't know if you guys have seen, maybe you have the Private Universe video. It's old now, but it was interviews with Harvard grads about some of these basic science concepts and how few of them could actually explain them. And it was things like seasons and phases of the moon, or how a seed grows into a big tree, and things like that. And it's really striking how much we assume that when we were using the transmission model of like pouring in their heads, or the accumulation model of just gluing on the facts, they didn't actually retain it in any way that made sense. And we have hopes that this approach will do more of that. And when I've had the chance to go into schools where they're doing this, or just the self-reports, it seems like there's a lot of great stuff where people are really seeing the difference for kids, both in how engaged they stay and how much they're driving their own learning, but then in how much it's sticking with them and how much they can explain, which just makes me feel really good about this approach. I wanted to say, I know we're not at time yet, so we have time for questions, but I just wanted to highlight a couple of things when reading Ready, Set, Science that I thought about reading it now instead of when it first came out. And that was that when you guys are reading it, to read it with a critical lens and think about, okay, which of these things really do apply to NGSS? Are there any things that don't? What's missing? Given we've advanced, there's an evolution, there's continued learning that informed the framework at NGSS. So what's missing in Ready, Set, Science that we might need to supplement? So to read it with a critical lens. And one of the things that I think in our learning on the board and the work that we've done that's in Ready, Set, Science, but not as deeply as it should be, are issues of equity and diversity and inclusion that in the framework became central. There's a whole chapter on it. We say it's for all kids and then try to really explain that means equity and inclusion need to be central. That doesn't come through in Ready, Set, Science as strongly. It's just something that over time, the folks in this community working on this learned, and I think in general in the literature on learning, whatever, became more central. And that's another critical lens that I would read it with, is that every time you're thinking about it, pausing and saying, okay, but what does this mean in the context of the framework in NGSS where we're pushing for all kids and we really mean it? Or when we need to have an equity and justice lens, what would that mean for the frame we've got in Ready, Set, Science? I think as a self-critique of where this book was when it came out, in 2007 or 8, we've come a long way in the last decade, and that's one of the things that I think we could push on as we revisit it and think about our current classrooms. Questions, comments, struggles?
Okay, I'm going to talk again, but last year I taught some honors classes, and I used some of the Illinois storylines. And this year I was told I'm not teaching those classes anymore because the students complained. They didn't feel like they were learning the stuff they're supposed to learn to get them ready for college, etc. And my administrators are social studies people, and they don't get it. So I just think we keep needing to try to get the word out to administrators that things need to change.
Yep. That's such a good point. There's an article at the higher ed level, just so there's a movement at the higher ed level to change teaching in ways that are more aligned with what we're now trying to do in K-12. And it's more, they call it active learning, but it's all the stuff we're talking about. It's not even as sophisticated as what we're talking about, to be blunt. But, and there was somebody who just published an article where they looked at actual learning outcomes for students who were engaged in classrooms that are more active and look like the NGSS, and then students' own self-report. And they could document that kids learned more, but they didn't think they did. Right? So they reported learning less, but their actual assessments showed that they learned more. I personally think, especially you're dealing with high school freshmen, I think it's some of the kids who've learned to do school really well, like those were honors classes, they think learning means a particular thing, and they expect to be asked to demonstrate their learning in a particular way. So they, those honors kids especially, like, they know how to do school. But we taught them that school is read the textbook, memorize, regurgitate it, blah, 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 blah. And so there's this difficult period of resistance. Administrators, for sure, it's a huge problem that there aren't as many STEM in general, let alone science folks who are in the administrative positions. I will say this is going to not help in the short term, but in the fall, we released a report called Science and Engineering in grades 6 through 12, which was pictures of instruction based on the NGSS, based on research. It's not as friendly as Ready Set Science. We actually wanted to do a version of Ready Set Science based on it. We couldn't get the money to do it. But we have the consensus study book, and we just got a little bit of money to do spin-offs, briefs for principals and superintendents. And so we want to target it to administrators to explain what this is about and what it means about what instruction is going to look like. And maybe even raise things like, and kids may not recognize it, parents may not recognize it, but there's evidence that kids learn more. So we're doing that. And we actually did get money to do another study, like Taking Science to School was on pre-K-5. So we can do stuff for the early childhood and up to 5th grade. And I'm actually going to reach out to NSTA and Achieve and say, hey, could we do like a whole campaign about elementary science? Because a lot of districts say that's the problem. Is the bar got raised pretty high for the NGSS for middle school, but that means more is being asked in elementary school, and there's not always the space because people really worry about math and literacy. So we're trying to work at the problem from the national level and kind of through the national organizations. So maybe we can have some tools in the next 6 months or so that you could use to argue with your administrators. Because I know it's a problem. We've heard it before. And it doesn't help them when you say, well, higher ed is actually trying to change what it's doing too. I mean, nobody, a lot of people aren't aware that that's happening at that level. Oh, I just saw that. I was told yesterday we can't work in elementary science because they're implementing a new ELA curriculum. It'd be too much for the teachers. I know, that's something. So we know this is an issue, and one of the things we're really trying to focus on is how can we, in doing this study, use it to send signals to administrators and districts about the importance of science and how much of the literacy in math can get taken care of in a meaningful context if you've got them doing good science. Aren't all curriculum areas being adjusted, revised, and improved yearly? I don't think the standards documents I don't think that happens in the standards documents yearly. That's typically on a longer cycle, but I don't know what Illinois' situation is.
I was actually referring to at Nicole's district level.
Oh, I see.
We know that the standards are.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
But, normal practice,
Yeah.
maybe just normal to me, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, is that you would meet periodically throughout the year with a curriculum team, tweak things. They're not going to be monumental changes because I only get to pull my people twice during the course of the year, and that's all my science people in the district. It's not enough time. But, we do some tweaking and revising, so it is different each year.
Yeah, they purchased a brand new elementary ELA program that they're implementing this year. And so
Yeah.
it would be too much, I guess, even though,
We
you
hear
can
that a lot.
teach,
Like
yeah,
when there's a shift in the ELA curriculum or
Mhm.
a new math series, if they're
Yep.
adopting a new math curriculum or adopting a new ELA curriculum,
Mhm.
that's the only thing that they're focusing on for the year. A lot of times,
Yep.
a lot of districts, not all districts.
Yeah.
Deep breath.
Right.
Heidi, any last thoughts or that you want to leave us with before we start digging into the book?
No, I think the things that I raised, that read it with a critical eye and think about what does it mean now and what might be missing. And also I'm available so that if there were questions that came up or you just wanted to shoot me an email and say, we had this question, we don't understand why you did this, or how did this
Right.
end up looking this way differently in the framework, I'm happy to answer them anytime. I'm just thrilled that you guys are taking the time to dig into it, and I hope it's useful.
Yeah, and I can't say how thankful we are for your generosity of your time to meet with us and talk with us and to offer that has been great for us. So we're excited to start digging in and having these discussions.
Great. That's great. And I realized I wish we'd gone around. I should have done this at the beginning and heard from each of you kind of what you're, where you are and what you're doing and how you're feeling about the NGSS, but another time.
We'll have you back. We do this every
Yes,
month.
that'd be great. Yeah, right. I wish I had the time.
Yeah.
Thanks. It was